Before discussing the specifics of the topic native bees in a changing world, I would like to go through a brief refresher of what native bees are. Any bee that has originated and evolved in an ecosystem and has not been introduced there by human agency may be considered native to that place. So, this encompasses both the bees that produce honey, that is belonging to the genus Apis, as well as to the bees that do not produce honey and are not in the genus Apis, commonly known as the solitary bees. Usually, all bees go through the same stages in their life history. Therefore, any threat that a honeybee faces may also be a threat that threatens a solitary native bee. Thus, when discussing the threats faced by the bees in a changing world, we may consider the threats faced by both the native solitary bees as well as the honeybees together. What are these threats? There are many different threats that come to mind, most prominent ones among which are the risks of invasive species, decline in genetic diversity in the brood stock of the bees, threats from pesticides, attack of pathogens and parasites. But the most important ones at the moment are threats posed by habitat and forage loss and climate change. Habitat and forage, even though these are two very distinct terms, why are we considering them under in one category, in one bracket? Uh, this is because bees do not tend to forage very far from their nesting sites or their habitats. Studies on honeybees are extensive, and it has been seen that they do venture far, sometimes even several kilometers, while studies on the solitary bees are fewer, which have shown that the solitary bees do not fly very far from their nesting sites, typically stay within 1500 meters, because solitary bees in the female in these species are responsible for making the nest, laying the eggs, provisioning for the larvae, so that they cannot abandon the nest and go very far to forage for food. So, habitat and forage tend to, or foraging sites for bees tend to occur close to each other, and conservation of one would be incomplete without conservation efforts for the other. Therefore, we must consider the threats to habitat and forage for bees together. So, when we are discussing about forage, let us take a quick glance at what typically constitutes forage plant for bees. Are all angiosperms forage plant for bees? No. Angiosperms or flowering plants, when they produce good source, when they are good source of pollen, when they are good source of nectar, that is when they catch a bee's fancy and act as bee pasturage or forage. Additionally, these plants may also be suitable nesting sites for which the bees visit them. It is not possible to list all the different bee plants that are visited by bees in India, and the studies are not complete also, especially for the solitary bees, even though we know what more about the plants that are visited by the honeybees. But we can make an attempt based on existing literature on what constitutes common forage, bee forage in India. I am listing the plants that have been identified by authors working in three different parts of the country, north, east and south. The plants that have been listed by these authors can be found almost throughout the country, so we may safely assume that these constitute common bee forage in India. The study in North in Uttar Pradesh was conducted by Chauhan and his colleagues in 2017. They based their study on pollen identified from honey. So the list of plants that they provide essentially document the plants which are visited by bees of the genus Apis. They list among other species prominently goatweed or ageratum, syzygium or the black plum, prosopis or mesquite, feronia wood apple, tinospora giloi, and eucalyptus to be favored by the bees. In the East, the study conducted by Singh and colleagues in Nagaland in 2016 documented the plants visited by bees of the genus Apis as well as the bees of species of stingless bee. So here the focus is not just only on species of Apis but also on stingless bees. They found that these bees visit capsicum, touch-me-not or mimosa, Barbados lily, ash gourd, and bottle brush. These plants can also be found in other parts of the country. In the south, in Bangalore, a very recent study conducted by Bhatt and Kumar identified the plants commonly visited by solitary bees. Their focus was not on honeybees in this case, which is encouraging. The plants visited by solitary bees in urban green spaces, and they saw that large number of solitary bees visit plants like the crepe myrtle, golden shower, Cape honeysuckle, wood sorrel, holy basil. Besides, I am also listing here some species of plants that are commonly found on our roadsides in West Midnapur district. These are most all considered weeds, but they profusely bloom during the post-monsoon season and therefore provide much necessary forage for the bees during this period, especially the small-sized solitary bees. So, what are the threats that these forage and habitat plants face? Topmost, the threat that is posed to these habitat and forage plants is by urban development. We are prone to paving all exposed surfaces. We have paved our sidewalks and therefore we have eradicated weeds and grass from our sidewalks. But these are vital nesting sites and foraging sites of solitary bees in particular. When urban agricultural intensification, when we are planting acres of land with flowering crops even like mustard or a sunflower, we may think that we are providing bees with adequate food and forage. But just as we can't survive on one particular type of food, similarly bees also need varied type of food, not just to meet the nutritional requirement but also to acquire components to build immunity, to provision their nests, build as construction materials for nest, and sometimes some species of male bees may visit different plants for alkaloids and oils to attract mates. But when we are going for agricultural intensification and monoculture and reducing diversity of flora, we are robbing the bees of these necessary elements. Pesticides, goes without saying, is a very prominent problem affecting all beneficial insects including bees worldwide. Vehicle runoff is particularly threatening for the bees that nest on the ground. Invasive species is another threat. When we are introducing exotic plants in an environment and replacing the native flora there, we are also replacing the native or threatening at least the native bees in that place. They may be robbed of their habitual forage and they may also be threatened by the pests and pathogens that the introduced invasive plant species may harbor. And finally, a major threat to the bees' habitat and forage at the moment is climate change. How does climate change affect bees? Climate change can exert both indirect as well as direct effect on bees. In the indirectly, they lead to forage and habitat loss. How? Mostly because of climate change and global warming, there is an alteration in the phenology of plants. Some flowering plants may be blooming much ahead of schedule. Some may be blooming for very short durations. There may be inclement weather conditions, unseasonal rainfall, which washes off pollen from the flower. Effectively, this reduces the foraging chances of the bees and they may be robbed of much needed nutrition. Directly, climate change is affecting physiology of the bees. A very recent study published in 2021 suggests that early spring onset decreases the weight of overwintering adult bees and reduces lifespan. It may be conjectured that the effects of climate change like high temperature and untimely rain affects physiology by affecting the endocrine system of bees. Much like all animals, their hormones are important for their vital developmental stages. But in climate change may be interfering there and negatively affecting it. Also, climate change may be causing behavioral changes in the bees, in addition to changes in its physiology. The study that we conducted in 2016 suggests that with increasing temperature, the feeding motivation of at least one species of honeybee, Apis florea, the dwarf honeybee, decreases. Why is this important? When temperature of winter in the winter season increases, then the which is this period when we have a lot of flowers and crops blooming, including mustard, sesame, and sunflower. With increasing temperature, the feeding motivation of the bee, if it is decreasing, this will prevent the bees from venturing out and pollinating these plants. So increase in temperature may not just be affecting behavior of the bees and reducing the feeding motivation, it may actually also be exerting negative effects on our economy by affecting pollination of vital crops. But is all doom and gloom, or is there anything that we can do to salvage the situation? Well, at an individual level, we may adopt some practices which can ensure that our homes and our towns and our cities are more bee friendly. By planting pollinator pastures, shelter strips, and hedgerows in agricultural land and urban areas, we may increase the diversity of nesting sites and foraging plants, which may encourage a greater abundance of native pollinating bees in that land. By planting shade trees like mimosaps and albizia, we may be actually providing much needed shade for the ground nesting bees, also providing them with nesting sites in the trunks of the trees. By not replacing woody structures made up of bamboo with cement and steel, we may be providing the carpenter bees with nesting sites. They need these woodworks to build their nests. By avoiding pesticides and herbicides in gardens and parks, and also switching to botanicals if necessary, we may ensure that we are not poisoning the bees. Also, I believe that weeds are not necessarily a menace. They are part of the ecosystem and they have their use. In fact, I recommend planting containers, just leaving containers unused for weeds to grow on the terrace. These provide much needed places for foraging and nesting for native solitary bees. By growing kitchen gardens even on the windowsill, we can encourage more pollinator visitation. And finally, we can educate ourselves more about bees and become bee friendly people or people. That will also add to conservation efforts and help in protecting these vital ecosystem components.